Sailors of Reddit, what's the weirdest creepiest thing you've seen at sea? I have family who sailed around the world. One day in the North Atlantic, their sailboat was going over some gigantic swells. They didn't have brakes at the top, so it was safe. But the boat was rising and falling way beyond the neutral. At the bottom of a trough, my uncle looked up to see the sun behind a wave and the silhouette of a whale inside. Above him. It was a foggy night off the shore of Long Island and I was on a 75-foot schooner. The fog was so thick that you couldn't see more than 10 feet in front of you. The captain tells me there is no point to continue my watch at the bow of the ship at him and I start talking at the stern. About that time there is funk on the side of the ship. We both turn to see a figure dressed in black flowing robes walking towards us on the outside of the ship. The robes were scratching down the outside of the ship. It keeps coming closer and is high enough in the air that the top was about even with our heads. It turns out that it was just a black flag to mark a lobster pot. But for those first few seconds it was terrifying. Lol. Fishing out near the Great Barrier Reef and my brother who gets seasick decides to go for a swim to settle his stomach and less than a minute after getting back into the boat a 17-foot great white went under the boat. Toilets on boats are usually plumbed with seawater because it makes no sense to sheet in your limited drinking water. One night I was taking the watch on a long haul sail up the US East Coast. We were rounding the FL Keys about to point towards Maine. I had to use the head. So I went below and pumped some water into the bowl. It was glowing in the dark. Freaked me out so much. Turns out there is photoluminescent phytoplankton in the water which will glow if pumped into a dark toilet bowl. No longer scary. Actually pretty neat. The stars. When you're 3 days from the nearest land. And it's a clear night. More stars than you could ever imagined. And enough shooting stars to make you run out of wishes. It was also pretty cool being stuck in the Panama Canal with a Los Angeles class submarine when they had to shut down the locks. Before we knew what was going on. There were helicopters everywhere dropping off Marines to set up around the lock. California to Los Angeles. Not me. But my father back in his commercial fishing days noticed that there was a t-shirt in the middle of his net after one tow. After a little investigation he found that it was not a shirt, but a human torso wearing a shirt. He said he was terrified that he would open the net and a head would roll out onto his feet. But it didn't happen. His captain radioed ahead and they brought the torso back to the docks, where they were met by the police and a coroner. They were eventually able to identify the body, based on the clothing, as a victim of a plane crash that had occurred fairly recently. My dad said he offered a free lobster to the coroner, who graciously accepted it until he found out that it had been found in the net with the body. After that he got angry and told him to throw it back. Not a sailor. But I was on a fishing charter boat on Lake Erie. It was around 5 AM in the morning. And the water was scary calm and glass-like. And it was so foggy you could not see more than 30 feet if that. We all started hearing this plopping sound. Like somebody was slapping the water with open hands. It kept getting louder and closer. At this point we had all slowly moved to the other side of the boat not knowing WTF it was. Even the boat captain was standing there in total silence as we all just stood there and listened to this plopping sound getting closer and closer. And to the shock of us all, a deer swam by the boat. Yes, a deer. It looked to be a very large buck with at least 10 points on his rack. We were more than 10 miles offshore so it made no sense at all. Can you say freaky? Fog. 360 degrees of thick fog. You can hardly see a couple feet in front of your face. Very creepy. And water spouts. Those are pretty cool though. Man. That fog must have been pretty hot. In fact, at 360 degrees I think it's referred to as steam. Sailing around in the Arabian Gulf you could look out and see flaming flares from all of the oil rigs. You get so used to blackness when you're out to sea at night and suddenly you see massive pillars of fire rising from the ocean all around you. I came across a man who'd hung himself on his boat 5 or 6 miles offshore about 4 or 5 years ago. The eerie and truly creepy part was realizing what it was. We just saw a boat out in the middle of oceans nowhere without anything other than blue horizon in sight. At the break of dawn. And there was fairly thick fog, as it had rained the night before. Realizing that the figure hanging from the boom was a man was one of the most haunting things I'll ever see. During a transatlantic sail, we saw this clump of brown about 200 yards off our starboard bow. When we sailed closer to get a close look, it was 6 leatherback turtles all dead. It looked as if someone had intentionally caught them, tied them together and left them for dead. We ended up cutting the lines and let them drift apart. This though was no accident. Turtles don't get tangled together and somehow make perfect bowlines and double half hitches. I was pretty pissed off. The next week we arrived in Street Helena, which was kinda our halfway point, and I told the local turtle care initiative. Till this day I still have no clue why someone would just tie turtles together and let them die. That had to be some sick duck. Edit. I'm done with all this Captain Jack Sparrow shit. Like, take some stuff seriously, duck. Heard this from a mate. Australian naval supply ship in the Great Southern Ocean, next to another naval ship. Swell was so great. The top of one ship's mast was deck level to the supply ship. Another. Told by a different mate, they were fishing off the shelf, off NSW. Boat big enough to hold 6 blokes. A shark longer than their boat swam past. They packed up and went home. Some things are too big and have too many teeth to fish near. Probably too late to get noticed. My grandfather was in the Norwegian Merchant Navy during the Second World War. Technically non-combatants, but still dangerous as duck. This one time they were sneaking out of a port at midnight that had been closed by the Nazis. They just pointed the ship out to sea in the pitch black and went. No lights. No nothing. He was standing peering over the side the inky blackness when he saw, like 20 get away. A Nazi on the deck of a darkened patrol boat light a cigarette right in front of him and then disappear. Losing your ship's service generator in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. Late at night. Most of the electrical service to the ship is lost until the emergency diesel generator hopefully starts up. When you're used to all the vibrations and sounds in your living spaces, silence is deafening. Probably late to this, but whatever. I was working on a car carrier 4 years ago in the Middle East. Our typical route went through pirate waters at times, and so we always picked up 4 ex-Marines as security in a harbor. Jordan before we went. One night while we were going through pirate waters off of Yemen we started to have problems with the main engine. So we stopped and had to drift for a bit to figure out what the problem was. During this time I was working on the stern, back end, of the vessel. I couldn't really see anything out in the ocean. Everything was dimly lit on the ship. I don't know why, but I got bored and turned on the spotlight and there he was. This guy with a gun in a rusted little boat staring at me about 15 feet from the ship. I just stared back at him, kind of stunned. I was afraid if I reached for the radio to call one of the Marines he'd shoot me. The Marines had weapons. So he looked at me and I looked at him and he sort of gave me a nod as if he was telling me well played and I gave him one back. Then he slowly rowed his boat back off into the deep pitch black night. I didn't know how many others there were, but I did call it in on the radio as soon as I lost sight of him. I still remember his face today. That deep stern concentrated look. When I was off the coast of Japan in 2007, I watched a whale die. I couldn't tell the gender, but I remember hearing those faint whale cries that you can sometimes hear at night beneath the surface. The moon was full and I could see it on top of the water and I saw other whales passing around it. Do whales have funerals? Because it felt like a vigil or saying goodbye. You could hear the faint puffs of the blowhole spraying out water in a larboard way. I don't know if it was heard or just old. These other whales made a few passes and then they left. And the whale wasn't spouting air anymore. This was all in a 15-minute period as we cruised past. I guess the whales may have been there longer, but I feel that they know that they don't want to stay around dead bodies for long. It was haunting and beautiful and I don't think I had ever cried as much as I had that night. Hurricane Katrina. We followed it down to provide aid for what everyone knew was going to be a disaster. It was as if the world had split in two. Above us was this beautiful sky with a few clouds strewn about. And then, not far ahead, was this ghastly monster that engulfed up the rest of the sky. It was green and purple and black. The clouds twisted in a way I've never seen before. And the seas were very deceptive. If you looked at the water you were sailing on, the swells didn't look that intense. But I saw frigates and destroyers swallowed bow first and shot through the other side. I was lucky. My ship was quite large. Even we were getting pelted on the 05 level of a supply ship, TAOE. And there were forget ever walking in a straight line. Most of the time you'd be walking on the deck one moment and then the bulkhead, wall, the next. I've been in rough seas before on both smaller and larger platforms. But Hurricane Katrina took the cake. It was just an event. One that I'm glad I was following and not intercepting. The sea is a vast and seemingly empty place. Many fail to grasp this when asking questions like, how can you just lose an airplane in the ocean? I found myself on my ship, somewhere in the vast expanses of the South Pacific Ocean. We had been cautiously avoiding big storms which I knew to be all around us, out further than the eye can see, although our local ocean area was calm and peaceful. I was on watch when I noticed something out there, in the distance, bobbing along, that I had never seen before, especially this far from land. As I got closer, I identified what was clearly a makeshift raft, made from lashed together bamboo, with a snap mast, and an empty cooler moored to the deck. Upon this raft was not a soul. The chances of coming across a raft to begin with are small enough in that part of the ocean. Thinking about the person, who once sailed that raft, why they sailed, and how they met their fate, that was what creeped me out. While traveling between Key West, FL and Norfolk, VA, roughly near Miami, our lookout called away a ship at 090. We got on our radar, range of 80 miles, and there wasn't a thing on it. A few of us went up to the crow's nest and used the mounted binoculars to look out there, and a WW2 style battleship could be hazily seen on the horizon. No evidence of it whatsoever would present itself on the radar. Pretty creepy. I was sailing a small sunfish around an island near Florida in shallow water. As I cruised along, suddenly a large section of water directly in front of my bow exploded with a large splash. Immediately afterward my boat rammed into something under the surface and came to a complete stop. My first thought was, I've hit a reef. But suddenly the entire boat was lifted up and spun around 90 degrees, almost dumping me into the water. Then there was another big splash and I saw something zoom away, leaving a wake behind it. I was left freaked out and shaking. Then I thought to myself, I must have hit a big dolphin. Maybe it was a manatee. Lots of dolphins around here. So I finished my sail and went home. When I got to the beach I pulled up the centerboard and found a real surprise. A 2-inch chunk had been bitten out of the wood. You could clearly see the marks of 3 large teeth. I'm very happy that I didn't fall out of the boat that day. When I was 19, I had just gone to sea for the first time with the US Navy. A few days after heading to the Gulf of Mexico for a few weeks of drug ops, we were dispatched to the Straits of Florida because Fidel Castro had opened the doors, and people were fleeing Cuba in droves. It was called Operation Able Vigil. One night after standing watch all day over dozens of people who'd been pulled out of the water, I was standing on the 03 level of the ship with the chief, smoking a cigarette. It was the only exterior surface of the ship not covered with refugees. It was a full bright moon that you could see reflecting on the ocean's surface. And we were talking about how crazy this all was, and looking at all of the other Navy and Coast Guard ships on the horizon doing slow circles looking for people like we were. Suddenly in the reflection of the moon, we both saw something pass through the reflection. He looked at me, and I nodded that yes, I too had seen something. He took off like a shot to the bridge, and ships started to circle back towards the thing we'd seen. It was a person in a life preserver just floating in the middle of the Straits of Florida. hoping someone would see him. There we were on this $2 billion missile-loaded warship doing slow circles, looking for people in the water. All told, my ship saved and or transported 1,800 people back to Gitmo for processing. Keeping in mind, ship's crew was only about 400 people. It left a big impression on 19-year-old me. My uncle runs a charter fishing boat. He loves telling the story about how he was out in the ocean on his boat at night, and there was this beautiful woman floating in a raft unconscious. He and my cousin pulled her aboard and she began to regain consciousness and she was really drunk. Apparently she ended up being on a party boat earlier and everyone just thought she was being too annoying. So to get rid of her they just put her on a raft and sent her off. Lived on a sailboat in Malaysia for a while. The monstrous jellyfish that would come floating by silently out of nowhere scared the absolute shit out of me. Easily half a meter in diameter. And hundreds of them. Worst creatures ever. Hurricane Katrina. My ship had just passed Cook's Passage when the wind and swell drastically increased. From the bridge wings you could touch the top of the swell and the deck was flooded constantly. The scariest part was when we found our holds were taking in water. Finally somewhere I can tell this story. Quite possibly the strangest thing I have ever seen in my life. It was about 2 AM in the middle of the Atlantic and very dark with no moon. As I was walking up to the bow of our sailboat to inspect the sails, I saw a faint glow in the water a long way off. I stared at the glow a long time before I realized there were actually two glowing objects moving quickly underwater, on a collision course with our boat. Immediately I thought it was some submarine or torpedo, about to ram our boat. But then the glowing shapes came right alongside the boat, perhaps a foot underwater. They were two ghostly blue dolphins, glowing brightly and so vivid and close in the clear water. I immediately realized the dolphins were being illuminated by bioluminescent plankton. But the sight was surreal. I watched them playing our bow wave for a while, imagining sailors of the past witnessing these eerie dolphin spirits and how mind-blowing that must have been. Night fishing just out of Melbourne. We'd been catching nothing but small flathead, so we decided to reel in our lines and head home. Felt a bit of weight on the end of the line, but there was no fight, so I figured it was just a bit of seaweed. It wasn't. It used to be a decent sized flathead. However, what remained was barely more than a skeleton. The only skin left was a small part stretched over the skull. Behind that, all that was left was shiny, wet bone and the still intact tail fin. I pulled it up and put it on the bait board, and noticed that the entire thing was covered in faintly luminescent bugs, swarming all over the bone and out of the empty eye sockets and gaping mouth. This poor bugger had been swimming around near the bottom, snatched my bait and then tried to hide in the sand. Unfortunately for him, the sand had apparently been swarming with sea lice, which had rapidly devoured him from the inside. The lines had only been in the water for 5 minutes or so. Out sea on a small fishing boat 50 feet I think. One night after we set the gear, my brother and I chucked a shark hook in to see what's out there. Went inside, chucked on the telly and having a cone when we felt the boat move unnaturally. Checked the hook and we had a good sized mako, est 14 feet, on it. Now being a shark lover, I really wanted this thing to go free, so we tried to get it up onto the gantry to let the slack off so we could unclip it. As we were lifting it, it was getting lighter instead of heavier and the shark was absolutely flipping out. By the time we got it above water level, from its pectoral fins down was gone apart from bits of cartilage, shark bone. And then we seen them. I don't know how many apart from a metric sheet ton of big ass squid. If one of us had fallen in wrestling this monster mako, it would have been all over. This memory really sticks out for some reason. Or a real creepy sound. There are a few out there, is whales. On a small fishing boat, your bed is below waterline. You can hear whales yabbering. It isn't quite as relaxing as a whale song CD. Freakiest was when we had to run for shelter behind a rock. It's a well-known safe rock. If any of you have seen Deadliest Catch, they use them occasionally. Just a big as rock that protects you from wind and waves. We made it. The boat 3 or 4 miles behind it. They all died. Not my story, but my dad's. He was in the Navy on an oiler in the first Gulf War. One morning he was shooting the sheet in the mess before going down to the boiler room. And one of the other debt heads mentioned he needed to go to a casino and gamble after they got back from the deployment, as they had gotten extremely lucky the night before. They had steamed through a minefield in an oiler ammo ship with enough jet A, bunker fuel and ammo to level several small nations. Dad said if they had hit a mine in the right spot, he'd not have had time to even mentally process what was happening.